Hey everyone, this is Scott. Have you been wanting to learn a new language but just keep putting it off? Let's make 2024 the year you finally check that off your list with Babbel. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. And Babbel's conversation-based technique teaches you useful words and phrases for things you actually talk about in the real world. I personally am using Babbel to learn Italian, and the courses really help with activities like ordering food, shopping, and meeting new people, without having to pull up the translator app. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/ancient. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/ancient. Spelled babbel.com/ancient. Rules and restrictions may apply.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hello everyone, my name is David Crowther and I'm here to tell you about my History of England podcast, a chronological retelling of the story of the English from start to finish. There's all the great events, politics, drama, bit of bloodletting here or there, and also how the English lived, worked and played, and some of their better gags, and the all-important context of the times they lived in. The History of England can be found on a good podcatcher near you, or even some bad ones, and at thehistoryofengland.co.uk.
If you're a fan of the ancient world, please support the Patreon page at patreon.com/theancientworld. And remember to like the Facebook page at facebook.com/ancientworldpodcast. Hey everyone, this is Scott. This episode is the second part of a 2-part spotlight series on the rise and fall of the Roman Emperor Galerius. If you want the full story, I recommend you start with the previous episode, S7, and then continue on with this one. Got it? Okay, let's pick things up where we left off. In 293 AD, the same year Galerius was elevated to Caesar, the news came west that the Persian king was dead. Bahram II had ruled the Persian Empire for the better part of 19 years, much of it fighting a civil war against his brother, Hormizd, who'd been based in the region of Sakistan. Once he'd triumphed, Bahram had installed his own son, Bahram III, as the local Sakan Shah. A famous relief at Naqsh-e-Rustam depicts the Persian royal family. Bahram II, his wife Shapur-Dukstak, Queen of Queens, his son Bahram III, Sakan Shah, and his uncle, the youngest and last surviving son of the legendary Shapur I, the 60-year-old Prince Narse. Narse, who'd ruled Armenia for 17 years before Bahram II had given it to Rome. As I mentioned in the final episode of the Bloodline series, Narse's older brother Bahram I had only gained power through the intervention of the Zoroastrian magus Kartir. But he'd never really been meant to rule, nor, by extension, had his son Bahram II. And the third time was definitely not the charm. So, on the death of Bahram II, Narse convinced the Persian nobility to back his claim to the throne. Before you could say Ahura Mazda, Bahram III was out and Narse was in. And in with a very new broom. Or, I should say, a very, very old one. The first item on Narse's list was reversing the recent imperial indignity of handing Armenia to the Romans. As Gibbon reports, Narse, who was now universally acknowledged as king of Persia, directed his whole force against the foreign enemy, to the effect that Tiridates III was a second time expelled from the throne of Armenia, and once more took refuge in the court of the Roman emperors. What's not made clear, but is kind of important, is whether Narse also invaded the new adjacent Roman province of Armenia. Or, alternately, that may have been where Tiridates had fled to. Either way, in 296, the Roman emperor and senior tetrarch, Diocletian, resolved to exert the force of the empire in the Persian War. According to Gibbon, while the big man settled into nearby Antioch, from whence he prepared and directed the military operations, the conduct of the legions was entrusted to the intrepid valor of Galerius. Okay, Galerius, this is your big moment. Time to get out there and shine. Gibbon reports that the armies soon encountered each other in the plains of Mesopotamia, and 2 battles were fought with various and doubtful success. But the third engagement was of a more decisive nature. Ah, that's more like it. Show 'em who's boss, Galerius. Oh, wait. And the Roman army received a total overthrow, which is attributed to the rashness of Galerius, who, with an inconsiderable body of troops, attacked the innumerable host of the Persians. Well, that's no good. As Gibbon highlights, the defeat took place close to Carrhae, where the Roman triumvir Marcus Crassus had been totally annihilated by the Parthians. And also, which he doesn't highlight, where the Emperor Caracalla had been knifed in the back while peeing in a roadside ditch. Just, not an optimal landscape for Roman triumphs. While Gibbon extols the bravery of the Armenian king, Tiridates III, who barely managed to survive the battle, he's less full-throated about Galerius, only reporting that we are ignorant of the circumstances of his escape. In the aftermath of this, complete and total disaster, Galerius was not eager to see his boss, and with good reason. Gibbon reports that when Galerius returned to Antioch, Diocletian received him not with the tenderness of a friend and colleague, but with the indignation of an offended sovereign. In a humiliating display, Galerius was forced to follow Diocletian's chariot for over a mile on foot, and probably, pick up his dry cleaning and maybe sit his cat. But after he'd been sufficiently chastised, he was given another chance. In 298, again per Gibbon, a second army was drawn from the veterans and new levies of the Illyrian frontier, and a considerable body of Gothic auxiliaries were taken into the imperial pay. At the head of a chosen army of 25,000 men, Galerius again passed the Euphrates. This time, instead of marching against Narse in the open plain, he advanced through the mountains of Armenia, then launched a nighttime sneak attack on the Persian camp at Satala. As Gibbon relates, the impetuous attack of Galerius spread disorder and dismay over the camp of the barbarians, and a slight resistance was followed by a dreadful carnage. A wounded Narse fled to Media, while Galerius came into full possession of his wives, his sisters, and his children, along with an enormous pile of Persian booty. From there, Galerius pressed on further south to sack the capital of Ctesiphon, which sounds like about as good as it gets. But the following year, 299, was very much the cherry on top. Gibbon reports that on the intelligence of the Roman victory, Diocletian condescended to advance toward the frontier. As he puts it, with a view of moderating, by his presence and counsels, the pride of Caesar Galerius. The pair met at Nisibis, an eastern city long contested by the Parthians, Romans, and Persians. And it was in that city that they soon afterwards gave audience to the ambassador of the great king, Narse. The ambassador's main goal was securing the return of the Persian royal family. But during the negotiations, he also struck a cautionary note about Rome not pushing its luck too far, given the frequent fickleness of fortune. At this, Galerius's fuse was lit, and you can easily picture the ensuing crescendo of barely concealed outrage. Because, guys, he was going to go there, to that injury that, even 45 years later, still ached when the rain came down. Y'all ready? Okay. Galerius began by acknowledging that it well becomes the Persians to expatiate on the vicissitudes of fortune, and calmly to read us lectures on the virtues of moderation. So, first off, someone's clearly been consulting his pocket thesaurus to increase his word power. Then, as Gibbon describes it, with a transport of fury that seemed to convulse his whole frame, Galerius unloaded the full ballista. Let the Persians remember their own moderation toward the unhappy Valerian. You all remember Valerian, right? The emperor who'd been captured alive in the famous Battle of Edessa? Galerius continued that the Persians vanquished Valerian by fraud, they treated him with indignity, they detained him till the last moment of his life in shameful captivity, and after his death they exposed his body to perpetual ignominy. That last being reference to the common belief that Valerian's corpse had been flayed and his skin stuffed with straw and preserved as a trophy in a major Persian temple. At this point, good cop Diocletian probably stepped in and told Galerius to grab a smoke in the hallway. But the point had been made. The Romans, and only the Romans, would dictate the terms of peace. And oh, my friends, they were pretty darn harsh. If Narsa thought losing Armenia was bad, you can only imagine his impotent rage when he got Rome's final demands. The annexing of 5 new Roman provinces between Armenia and the Tigris, the right to install the kings of Transcaucasian Iberia, basically modern Georgia, and the establishment of the Tigris as the border between empires. And, of course, Tigranes III was restored as king of Armenia. Though he was still only Caesar and not quite Augustus, the Treaty of Nisibis was likely the high point of Galerius's imperial career, which is why it's commemorated in one of his few surviving monuments, a monument that, as I write this episode, stands only a few dozen meters away. It's a magnificent triple Roman arch on the Via Egnatia in Thessaloniki that's known as the Arch of Galerius. Actually, even calling it a triple arch undersells it. The original monument was actually an octopylon, which is basically a triple tetrapylon with 8 pillars. The main surviving marble reliefs show Galerius's conflict with Narsa, including the two of them personally fighting on horseback, which, like Bahram II's relief of him trampling Carus, is something that probably never happened. Another relief shows Galerius's family, including Diocletian's daughter Valeria, giving a Thanksgiving sacrifice, and with Galerius wearing military dress. A third relief shows the Tetrarchy assembled, with the 2 Augusti, Diocletian and Maximian, being crowned with victory wreaths. It's truly stunning, and yes, I'll be posting plenty of pictures. By the time the arch was dedicated in 303, a new theme was sweeping the empire: a growing intolerance of Christians. We covered a lot of early Christian history over the span of the Bloodline series, and there have certainly been periods of serious, sustained persecution. I'll also mention that one Roman emperor, Philip the Arab, may have actually been Christian, though if so, he'd very much kept it on the down low. Diocletian was no friend of the Christians, and during his 18 years since coming to power, he tried to purge them from the army, mainly by making them publicly sacrifice to Roman gods. But in 303, supposedly at the urging of Galerius, Diocletian issued his edict against the Christians. The edict ordered the destruction of Christian churches and forbade the Christians from assembling in worship. Several subsequent suspicious fires at Diocletian's palace in Nicomedia only fanned the flames of repression. Though the character of the Great Persecution was mixed, severe in the east, fairly lax in the west, it was not a wonderful time to be a Christian. And the ancient authors fixed the blame almost entirely on Caesar Galerius. Lactantius gives us a bit of a backstory. He asserts that Galerius's mother had been a votary of the gods of the mountains. Being of such a character, she made sacrifices almost every day, and she feasted her servants on the meat offered to idols. But the Christians of her household would not partake of those entertainments, but instead continued in fasting and prayer. On this account, she conceived ill will against the Christians, which she passed on down to her son. Take it with a grain of salt, but it does reflect a contemporary source of friction. The Christians' holier-than-thou attitude, kinda literally, and their refusal to toe the line on Roman traditions. There was also the fact that Galerius's tetrarchal capital of Thessaloniki was a hotbed of early Christianity, as you may have gleaned from a few epistles known as 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. To Lactantius, though, it really came down to Galerius's own brutal nature, commanding that Christians be humiliated, tortured, then slowly burned to death. He also asserts that the cruelty which Galerius learned in torturing the Christians soon became habitual, and he exercised it against all men indiscriminately. Again, this is a fairly extreme take by a Christian writer with an obvious axe to grind. But it's also true that Galerius wasn't playing to the crowd. The only opinion that really mattered was that of his boss, Diocletian. And in his boss's estimate, Galerius was doing just fine. We know that because in 305, Galerius got his last big promotion. On May 1st of that year, in the wake of a long, debilitating illness, Diocletian publicly announced that he was retiring. The reason he gave was pretty compelling. He wanted to settle down near his old hometown to grow some prize-winning cabbages. For any of you that are new to this story, I am 100% not joking. You can look it up. Though I'm sure that the illness also played a part. Diocletian continued that his co-Augustus of the West, Maximian, would also be stepping down. Did you hear that, Maximian? Yes, you're retiring as well. Do not give me that look. Which meant that Galerius and the Western Caesar, Constantius Chlorus, were both promoted to full Augustus, which also opened the way for two new Caesars. Now, if Diocletian really wanted a stable system, he needed to either pick both new Caesars himself or give one pick each to his new Augusti. But Diocletian did the other thing and handed both picks to Galerius. We can only speculate on the reasons why. Gibbon asserts that Diocletian considered Galerius, who had married his daughter, as the firmest support of his family and of the empire. But, and to paraphrase Pee Wee Herman, it's a very big but, he did this without consulting the interest or inclination of the princes of the West, i.e. Maximian and Constantius, each of whom had a grown son who they, might want to inherit, sons who, spoiler alert, would eventually face off in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Some ancient sources propose Diocletian was actually afraid of Galerius. Lactantius gives us the over-the-top. Galerius was of stature tall, full of flesh, and swollen to a horrible bulk of corpulency. By his speech, gestures, and looks, he made himself a terror to all that came near him. His father-in-law, too, that's Diocletian, dreaded him excessively. Lactantius also relates that after his victory over Narsa, Galerius rose to such a pitch of haughtiness that he claimed his mother, Romula, had been impregnated by Mars and that he was the resulting offspring, which hints at a bit of megalomania. Gibbon, a bit more reserved, credits Galerius with possessing a stern temper, and while he commanded the esteem of his subjects, he seldom condescended to solicit their affections. For the two new Caesars, Augustus Galerius picked two of his personal cronies. His nephew Daza, commonly known as Maximinus Daia, who was given control over Egypt and Syria, and a friend and army paymaster named Severus, given power over Italy and Africa. Which is how you take 3/4 of an empire without even striking a blow. Now there was the quarter still ruled by the popular Western Augustus, Constantius Chlorus, whom Severus was nominally loyal to as Western Caesar. But, not really. Speaking of loyalty, Lactantius also asserts that once Diocletian retired, the Dacian-born Galerius avowed himself the enemy of the Roman name, and he proposed that the empire should be called not the Roman, but the Dacian Empire. Which sounds super crazy, and it is Lactantius, so take it with a shaker of salt. Either way, it's clear he was angling for a fully Galerian empire. It all fell apart the following year when Constantius Chlorus died in York, upon which his son, Constantine, was elevated to Augustus by his intensely loyal troops. After cycling through, as Gibbon puts it, surprise, disappointment, and rage, Galerius finally calmed himself down. He decided to ignore the informal elevation, but as a practical compromise, he accepted Constantine as Western Caesar under his personal crony, Severus, whom he elevated to Augustus. Which was a nimble enough pivot, but still a super annoying fly in the ointment. And unfortunately, it was only the start. A little more background. Not only had the Tetrarchy introduced Eastern-style despotism to Roman rule, without the slightest nod to the old institutions, it had also led to a huge increase in taxation. One reason was that money was now needed to fund 4 imperial courts, each one trying to outdo the others. When you add that Diocletian had also fixed prices, well, yeah, rough times all around. Except in the old home province of Italy, which was exempt from the worst abuses. Or at least it had been until Augustus Galerius went looking for a new source of income. As he turned the screws, both figuratively and literally, there was definitely torture, the recently sidelined and demoralized Romans decided that enough was enough. That, per Gibbon, they could no longer patiently brook the insolence of an Illyrian peasant, who, from his residence in Asia, presumed to number Rome amongst the tributary cities of his empire. Galerius was actually a Dacian peasant, but you still get the gist. No sooner had they all broke out into Bonnie Tyler's holding out for a hero than who rides up on a fiery steed but, wait for it, Galerius's son-in-law, Maxentius. That's the part that would have driven Galerius crazy. It's probably more important to point out that he was the former Augustus Maximian's son, Maxentius. But he was also married to Galerius's daughter, Valeria, which was probably the part that stung most. Strong and fast and fresh from the fight, check, check, and check. And those old slighted symbols of Roman power, the Praetorian tribunes and the Roman Senate, proclaimed Maxentius to be the good old-fashioned emperor of Rome. Not only that, but one quick call home, and Maxentius's dad, the recent former Augustus Maximian, turned off the game, strapped on his sword belt, and came to the aid of his son. Together, they made quick work of Galerius's man, the ill-fated Severus Augustus, who was taken prisoner and graciously allowed to commit suicide. Well, F this S. Forget this stuff. Galerius had to reassert control. So, nephew Daza hold down the fort while I march off to Rome. The problem was, the father and son M&M team were hardly pushovers. Maximian had run the whole West for ages, and he knew how to defend his territory, whether against rampaging Alemanni or a ticked-off Eastern Augustus. He was also no political slouch, and enlisted the help, or at least the neutrality, of Constantine Caesar by giving him his daughter Fausta as a bride and elevating him to co-Augustus, which made Constantine and Maxentius brothers-in-law, and all three of them full Augusti. Aye. At this point, per Gibbon, Galerius expressed his intentions, in the furious language of a barbarian, to extirpate the Senate and to destroy the people by the sword. In response, Italy threw its considerable weight, militarily, monetarily, morally, you name it, behind Maximian and Maxentius. Not only that, but Maximian's popularity and some lucrative bribes caused Galerius's legions to waver. Before long, Galerius was forced to provide for his safety by making a timely retreat, with his soldiers murdering, ravishing, and plundering along the way. Impotent rage seems to capture the general theme. Back home in Thessaloniki, Galerius decided that the deck chairs on his sinking ambitions maybe needed a good rearranging. So he took another crony of his, Licinius, and made him Augustus of the West in place of the now dead Severus, despite the fact that the West already had 3 very active Augusti. At which point the only remaining Caesar, Galerius's nephew Daza, must have felt like a certified chump, so he demanded his uncle give him equal title. So we're all keeping track, right? You've heard of the Year of the 6 Emperors? Well, this is the Year of the 6 Emperors at the exact same time. Or, I guess technically, we're talking about a sexarchy, which, for Galerius, probably felt much less erotic than it sounds. Either way, 6 soon became 5 with the death of Augustus Maximian. Remember I mentioned last episode that his fearlessness of consequences would come back around to bite him? What happened was Maximian tried to steal Constantine's territory while the latter was off fighting the Franks. It ended, I'm going to say, not that well, with Maximian put to flight, cornered, and eventually strangling himself by his own hands. Thus ended the man who'd once ruled half of the Roman world. And the next to die, a few years later, was our nominal protagonist, Galerius. According to Lactantius, in 311, the 18th year since he'd first been elevated, God struck Galerius with an incurable plague. A malignant ulcer formed itself low down in his secret parts and spread by degrees. He grew emaciated, pallid, and feeble. The ulcer became insensible to the remedies applied, and a gangrene seized all the neighboring parts. It diffused itself the wider, the more corrupted flesh was cut away, and everything employed as a means of cure served but to aggravate the disease. Lactantius is also happy to give you 3 guesses what brought on this horrible affliction. The author suggests that near his end, Galerius tried to make atonement for his misdeeds, mainly by publishing an edict that allowed the Christians to pray, as long as they prayed for the welfare of the public and for their own welfare, and, of course, for the welfare of Galerius. Despite the horrors of his final days, Gibbon notes that Galerius preserved, till the moment of his death, the first place among the princes of the Roman world. He also caveats, and I'm forced to agree, that Galerius filled with more glory the subordinate station of Caesar than the superior rank of Augustus. On his death in 311 AD, at the age of 58, Galerius was buried at Felix Romuliana, close to the place of his birth. His tomb was part of an imperial complex he'd constructed after his Persian victory, one that served as a combination villa, monument to his deeds as emperor, and place of worship of his deified mother, the pagan priestess Romula, to which we can add, at the very end, a resting place for his body. But there's one big hint that may not have been Galerius's original plan. Galerius also had strong ties to his tetrarchal capital of Thessaloniki, and at the time he'd built his triumphal arch, the one that shows his defeat of Narsa, he'd erected a colonnade linking the arch with the newly constructed mausoleum. The mausoleum is a massive circular structure over 24 meters in diameter and with walls over 6 feet thick. It's commonly referred to locally as the Rotunda. Since Galerius ended up being buried near his hometown, the Rotunda of Thessaloniki sat unused for most of a century, until, in the reign of the Christian emperor Theodosius, it was converted into a Christian church, as, by the way, was Diocletian's mausoleum in Split, Croatia. Symbolic revenge for their joint persecution of the early Christian church. Despite the subsequent centuries of use, both remain very impressive structures. I'll post some pictures. So I'm going to end the story here with the death of Augustus Galerius. His old boss Diocletian barely outlived him, passing away in Split later that same year. The deaths of all 4 original tetrarchs, Diocletian, Maximian, Constantius Chlorus, and Galerius, did nothing to stem the ongoing troubles. As Gibbon describes, Galerius had no sooner expired than the 2 emperors who were indebted for their purple to his favors, that would be Daza and Licinius, began to collect their forces, with the intention either of disputing or of dividing the dominions which he had left without a master. It's a process that would eventually result in a certain battle near a certain bridge and the ultimate triumph of Constantine the Great, which is maybe a story for another time. I hope you enjoyed this double episode on the life and times of the Emperor Galerius. And yes, I can now officially say I write episodes about the places I travel to, at least sometimes. Thanks again for listening. The Ancient World podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, along with My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, the Explorers podcast, and other great shows.